Hey everyone, Jump for Nintendo Life here! And did you know that every pre-Breath of the Wild 3D Zelda game has been remastered at this point? All of these games have now had an HD or a 3D version, and I thought it'd be fun to rank them, because they're not all equal. Some of them excel, and other ones maybe damage what the original game was even going for. So in this video, I'm going to talk about every single remaster individually, the pros and cons, and at the end we are going to rank them. And I do suggest watching this entire video rather than just skipping to the ranking, because the ranking's going to be rather quick. Most of the explanation is going to be in the individual segment. So with all that in mind, let's mosey with this. And by the way, Link's Awakening will not be included, because that's not built on the source code and is really more of a remake than a remaster. But anyway, these ones, let's talk about them! So Ocarina of Time 3D, both the N64 version and 3DS versions were blisteringly high 240p. To be expected, but it does look pretty good on the small 3DS screen. However, it is now widescreen on 3DS, whereas N64 is stuck in 4:3. But what really matters performance-wise is the frame rate. On N64 in NTSC territories like North America and Japan, the game ran at 20 frames per second, whereas in PAL territories like Europe, it ran around 18 frames per second, which is not very fast. So the big boost on 3DS is the game is now 30 frames per second, which might not sound like a huge brag, but going from 18 to 30 is massive. The game never ran smoothly on N64, but now it runs really well. And obviously graphically, there's been a bit of an overhaul too. Everything's based on the source code of the original game, but the textures have been drastically changed. Models too, look at young Link on N64, and now look at him on 3DS. Everything looks much closer to the official artwork, and that's very cool. There's brilliant texture work across the board, it's a very good looking game. Even the pre-rendered areas are now fully modelled. So places like Link's house, or Castle Town, or the approach to the Temple of Time, they are all now fully 3D models. Now I wouldn't say that everything is objectively better. It's a much brighter game than the N64 version, and this can drastically shift the tone. Like for example, the final showcase with Ganon is now arguably far too bright. Castle Town's also much more bright and vibrant, and not everyone loves that. The medieval tone's kind of gone. And while I personally like the contrast of the bright town in the past and the disrupted and broken town in the future, the colourful town is just a bit too sterile for my liking. All in all though, a brilliant visual remaster. But there are much more changes beyond the visuals. 3DS has two screens, and so all the HUD is now on the bottom screen, leaving the top screen very clear and beautiful. So not only are your hearts and your magic meter on the bottom screen, but as is your inventory. There's no need to pause the game anymore and shift through different screens, just tap items or tap gear, and you're there. You can even drag and drop the items onto buttons, making everything much faster. And there's more buttons there too. On N64 it was just 3 C buttons, but now you have X and Y as physical buttons and also 2 touch buttons, giving you another item slot. Not only that, but the ocarina itself is now a permanent button in the bottom left hand corner, meaning that no longer occupies an item slot. The iron boots are also no longer gear, but rather an item. So in the water temple now, there's no longer any need to pause the game and go to gear and find the iron boots, and then play with them for like a few seconds, and then open up the menu and go back to gear and find the normal boots. You just tap the item whenever you need it. And speaking of the water temple, that's been revamped too. There's much more color coding, making navigation far easier. When playing your ocarina, you can tap this icon right here, and it will show you all the songs. Now this is kind of a double-edged sword, because on one hand, memorizing the songs was quite fulfilling on the N64, but on the other hand, this is very easy. You can also play by tapping the touchscreen, and it's just like playing an actual ocarina, apart from you're not blowing into it, or playing an instrument. Speaking of songs, the compositions are new. You might not know that, but they are. They just sound exactly the same. One of my favourite changes is the text is now much faster. On N64 it was this crawl that slowly went around the screen, but now you can zip and zap through all the text. It's a game changer, really. You can also move the camera around, kinda. When you're L targeting, gyro kicks in, and moving the system around moves the camera. You can disable this because it doesn't really do much, but it is there. But speaking of gyro, this game basically pioneered Nintendo's modern implementation of gyro. This predates Splatoon by like 4 years. God, this simply changed how Nintendo did aiming. From here on, every Zelda remaster would have this, and even games like Mario Odyssey have gyro as well. It was so good and it made a big impact. The game introduced a boss rush mode for the very first time. Now, this is technically the first Zelda game to do this. I mean, Wind Waker had one as part of the game, it didn't really count, but Ocarina of Time 3D predates Skyward Sword by a few months. And yeah, you can replay any boss whenever you want to from the comfort of your own home. They also added some Sheikah stones into the game to give you some advice. You can ignore them entirely, but I suppose this is, pretty cool for new players. The Shard of Agony no longer vibrates because it can't vibrate, so instead it does a little beep. And finally, the Master Quest is back from the GameCube game, only this time, it flips everything. Just like Twilight Princess on GameCube and Wii. So Link on 3DS can be right-handed. Bizarre. So this version definitely enhanced Ocarina of Time, while still in most cases respecting the legacy of the original game. It's a brilliant remaster, and to this day, I'll say it remains one of the very best remasters ever made. But the thing is, a few games in this video also share that title. So let's keep going with Wind Waker HD. So this is an interesting one because it was kind of positioned as the Wii U's big game for that year. Breath of the Wild was way off, so this was kind of the buffer Zelda title, even though Twilight Princess also ended up being a buffer Zelda title. But anyway, here we go. So Wind Waker's going from the 480p resolution of the GameCube game to 1080p, but this time it's also in widescreen, which GameCube could not do natively. Though it still runs at 30 FPS, there's no gain here, and if anything, performance is actually a bit worse than it was on GameCube. This doesn't really get brought up too often, but every time there's an explosion, the game slows down. The frame rate seems to be tied to the game's speed, so everything just kinda goes in slow motion, and I can demonstrate this really well by chaining together explosions, so watch this right here. Very odd, and it's pretty distracting when you're fighting another boat on the sea and there's explosions everywhere, and everything's just slowing down. But it's not just explosions, the weather does this too. Digital Foundry posted this video when the game came out, and as you can see, it spends a lot of time at around 20 FPS. Just in terms of performance, this is the most inconsistent remaster. But people don't really talk about that, they talk about the visuals, and yeah, there's a pretty drastic change. Now in terms of textures and models, nothing's changed. These are the original textures and models made for the GameCube game. They weren't redrawn. The main difference is, of course, the lighting. This changes a lot about how the game looks. The shadows, for instance, are far more dynamic and impressive. And the hues of the ocean and the sky change with the lighting. It can look absolutely stunning. Wind Waker was always a timeless game visually. The textures are just kind of flat colors, and that looks great even 20 years later. It's definitely got its imperfections, but people often herald this as one of the most drastic remasters, even though really, it's not changing that much, it's mostly just the lighting. And unlike Ocarina of Time 3D, the music has been redone, and you can tell this time. It wasn't orchestrated, but it's a much higher quality MIDI than last time. Now, throughout this video, we'll be talking about a bunch of quality of life improvements, but I think many changes to Wind Waker HD go beyond quality of life. They go to changing the entire game. And one of the biggest problems with the original was the Triforce quest. This came right before the end of the game, you're about to face off against Ganon, and then it goes, nope, you've got to go on a scavenger hunt that's going to take you like 10 hours. And it's not gone, it's still here, but they've streamlined it a ton. So on GameCube, first you have to get a chart from Tingle to find a Triforce shard, and these charts cost 398 rupees a piece, and because there's 8 of them, that's going to cost you 3,184 rupees. That takes a while to grind. This time though, only 3 of the 8 shards require a chart. Not only that, but the starting wallet's gone from 200 rupees to 500 rupees, so there's no need to do a side quest to get a bigger wallet to even buy a seed chart. And sailing around to get these shards is way faster and easier now because of the Swift Sail. You can get this really early on in the game in the auction house, and basically what this does is not only does it make sailing faster, but it defies wind direction. You can sail at beyond max speed and just whip around the world. Some may argue this undermines sailing, and they're probably right, it probably does, but it certainly cuts down on downtime. And the game does quite a bit to cut down on downtime. In the original, whenever you play a song with a Wind Waker, Link would then play it again back to you, no matter how many times you do it. But in the remaster, Link only does this once, so I can keep playing this song right here, and it'll just go straight to the warping screen. No need to see this animation again and again and again. Likewise with the grapple hook. On GameCube there's this quite slow animation, whereas on Wii U, it just goes zoop, and it's done. And hey, this is important. Selfies! Selfies are in this game, and you can change Link's expression when you take a picture. That's big! Post it on Miiverse! And speaking of Miiverse, Miiverse was in this game. So on GameCube there was the Tingle Tuner, and using this there was Game Boy Advance compatibility, but of course Wii U can't do that. So in its place are these Tingle bottles, which are basically Miiverse messages in a bottle that you find in the game, and then read it within the game. So you could be sailing around with nothing to do, and so you look down at your gamepad and read the messages, and see what interesting things people have sent out to the world. And speaking of the gamepad, this game used the gamepad remarkably well. You basically never need to pause. This is brilliant while sailing because you can see the map on the screen at all times. I mean, most of what you see on the screen is just one big empty blue ocean, so to see where you're actually going is pretty important. And the items are really cool. Not only can you drag them in real time without pausing the game, but you can flick them. That's like a game within itself, look. Zoop, zoop, zoop. You can spend hours doing this. And Jaru's back, baby! You know what, kind of related to this is a strange new feature, first person mode. You could go in first person in the GameCube game, much like you can in most 3D Zeldas, but you're stuck in one spot. But weirdly in Wind Waker HD, and no other remaster, you can walk around in first person. Really weird, but also really cool. And following Skyward Sword, this was the second game to have hero mode. This means enemies do double damage, and hearts don't appear in the overworld, so you have to rely on potions. So Wind Waker HD isn't perfect technically, there's definitely a lot more they can do to polish this game up, but it improves so much from a gameplay perspective over the GameCube game. It can be kinda hard to go back. But anyway, we're not looking back, we're looking forward, so let's go to 2015 with Majora's Mask 3D. Now this is a divisive one. So pretty much everything I said for Ocarina 3D can be applied to this too. On N64 it was 20 FPS at 240p, on 3DS it's 30 FPS at 240p in widescreen, the exact same as Ocarina. There's dual screens, there's gyro, you can touch items, there's another item slot, the Ocarina's over here, yada yada yada, you know all this stuff already. But with all these quality of life features in mind, Majora's Mask is the most drastic remaster of all of these. It goes beyond these simple bells and whistles, a lot of the game was changed. But this also does apply technically because visually, I'd say this is far and away the most impressive remaster of the lot. This is some of the best texture work out of the entirety of the 3DS library. Sometimes I just stop and admire some of these textures, they're really good for the system. But whether they keep the original vision intact, that's more debatable. It's certainly very clean a lot of the time and lacks the imperfections the original had that made them feel so dark and tattered. It's a different kind of vibe, and that really defines this entire remaster. Many of the changes to the game aren't exactly fixes, they're just changes. And of course, the most divisive of the lot is the fishing holes. They added fishing, how dare they? There's two of them! There's two fishing holes. Grrr! And a camera! This game released with a new 3DS, and so the C-stick can be used to turn the camera around. Grrr! Makes me mad! You can use a Circle Pad Pro too if you've got a standard 3DS. Grrr! Okay, those two are cool. Adding camera control to a game that never had it is a big deal, and it really does change how you move throughout the game. That can't be understated, that's awesome. But speaking of how you move throughout the game, so many movement elements have just been downgraded. For instance, the Zora swimming is just boring now. On N64 it was really versatile and fast and fluid, and you can zip through the ocean, and it felt like a powerful and invigorating Master Wear. And on 3DS, you just can't dive, you just like normally swim around. You can hold the R button to kinda swim like you could on N64, but it's still not quite the same, and it consumes your magic meter really fast, so you just kinda don't do that. It's not just the Zora mask either. Deku Link is really underwhelming. He's far slower than he was in N64, and this greatly affects how you skip across water. You now just barely make your jumps to the next lily pad. And on N64 you can spin and carry your momentum as you hop across, whereas on 3DS, you can still do that, but it's nowhere near as smooth or as fun. So what you do now is you spin around on the lily pad to build up speed, and then you spin kind of from the edge of the lily pad until you get to the front, and that way you kind of carry it forward, but again, that doesn't sound as fun, does it? And if it were just that some of the transformations operate differently, that wouldn't be a massive deal, but that's not where it ends. They changed the boss battles in Majora's Mask 3D, and they're frankly not better. Many of them in the original game had a lot of experimentation and different ways to beat them, but that's not the case anymore. There's just one predetermined way. It feels far less experimental and way more rigid. There's other aspects where they've given you more control, which might be good for some players, but for others, it kind of undermines the point of the game. Like on N64, the Song of Double Time pushed the game forward by 6 hours, but now, you can choose exactly where you want to go to, and that much freedom over the game's clock does take away a lot of the stress, which is kind of the point of Majora's Mask. The stress was kind of a motivator, an invigorator to get you to do what you want to do within the time frame, but now you control the time frame. That extends to saving too. You can pretty much save anywhere. You still save at Owl statues, but there's now many more statues around the world. And that might not sound like a bad thing, and really, it's not a bad thing. But it's just all these little elements coming together to undermine the point of Majora's Mask. You no longer really feel the pressure of time. Everything is far more relaxed. It kinda made Majora's Mask just another Zelda game. And for those who couldn't enjoy Majora's Mask in its original state, I guess that's a good thing for them. And if that were it, maybe this remaster would be fine, but that combined with the downgraded movement possibilities, it just feels like a lesser game. There's even weird little things like ice arrows can no longer just freeze any pool of water, it's just these predetermined spots, so there's no puzzle to that anymore. There's certainly things this game does well. It's beautiful, the camera's awesome, fishing's awesome, all the quality of life stuff from Ocarina, they're all awesome, but the changes made to the game itself have diminished the point of Majora's Mask, to me at least. I simply found it a bit underwhelming as a Majora's Mask fan. But then, just the following year on Wii U, came Twilight Princess HD. It was in a bit of a weird place where, when you look at it, you just kind of see Twilight Princess. You don't see the drastic shift like Wind Waker HD, and people already had in their mind the tech demo for Wii U, and this looks nothing like that. But if you go beyond the initial impressions, this may be one of the best remasters. So for starters, this is going from 480p to 1080p, much like Wind Waker HD. Unlike the prior games, this was already in widescreen on Wii, and it's still 30 FPS. Though unlike Wind Waker, this is a pretty stable 30 FPS. There are a few moments where it dips, like early in the game when the Farron Woods is filled with fog, but nothing as inconsistent as explosions. You also get both the GameCube and Wii perspectives through Hero Mode. Hero Mode's just like it is in Wind Waker, but much like Ocarina of Time 3D's Master Quest, it flips the entire game, which I guess most people are used to because the Wii version of Twilight Princess is the second best-selling Zelda game. But one thing I think always gets overlooked is just how far this game goes to overhaul the look of Twilight Princess. I mean, this is the Wii version, and look at the floor, look at this wall. It's a very, very blurry game. So let me show you a very quick comparison. I'm going to scoop up a potion in the Wii version, and this gives us a great look at the floor and surrounding textures. And let's quickly go to the HD version. Do you see the difference? If not, I think you might need to talk to someone. The quality of the texture work in Twilight Princess HD is far beyond the original. It leaves it way in the dust. I often hear the sentiment that this was a lazy remaster, and I think it actually does more than Wind Waker did. Wind Waker was mostly just the lighting, the textures were hardly even touched, whereas for Twilight Princess, they have done everything. Granted, it's not always perfect, I mean the door handle is on the wrong side of the door here, but for the most part, this is a really good looking game. The only jarring thing though is the models are the exact same, so you've got these really high quality textures with these GameCube quality models. The controls are a brilliant mix of GameCube and Wii. I love the Wii controls for pointing and aiming, but when it comes to swordplay, it's a little bit of a waggle fest. GameCube was far more natural just having you press the B button, and so the Wii U version has the GameCube combat, but the brilliant motion aiming. I mean, look at this. One thing that's really lame though with the gamepad is you can no longer flick items. Look at this! They broke it! Why? This is irredeemable. Gah, Tantalus. There is a new button on the gamepad that turns you into a wolf without talking to Midna. That's neat. The base Twilight Princess game didn't have that much to fix in terms of pacing and game structure, but there are still some changes here. For instance, Link climbs and swims faster. They just kinda sped up the animation, so it does look a little bit odd, but it definitely cuts down on downtime. But here, and no hyperbole, is the biggest change of any remaster. When you turn the game on GameCube and Wii, no matter how far you were into the game, it would always tell you what a rupee is. Oh, this blue rupee means you get 5 rupees. I know, I've been playing the game for 50 hours. It no longer does that, and I am very, very happy. Also, much like in Wind Waker, the base wallet size was increased too. It's gone from 300 to 500. And there's also a much larger post-game wallet to get to in the Cave of Shadows. This lets you hold 9,999 rupees. And you might wonder, what is the Cave of Shadows? Well, that is also new. Most physical copies of the game came with the Wolf Link amiibo, and tapping this takes you to the Cave of Shadows. It's basically a gauntlet like the Cave of Ordeals, apart from you're just Wolf Link this time. So you're fighting waves of enemies going from floor to floor, and unlocking new goodies as you go. But also doing this gives more hearts to the Wolf Link amiibo, and that carries the Breath of the Wild too, giving Wolf Link far more health in that game. Other amiibo are supported, but they're a little bit lame. Tapping Zelda or Sheik gives you more health, tapping Link or Toon Link gives you more arrows, but tapping Ganondorf makes you take twice as much damage. And if you're on hero mode already, that's 4 times the amount of damage. That's kind of a fun challenge. There's also a brand new pose lantern that shakes on poser nearby. Makes the entire side quest a lot more fun. And look at this UI in the Wii version. When the minimap's out, you can see like this much of the game. Whereas in the HD version, you can see a lot more. Some treasure chests have Miiverse stamps too, giving a bit more completion to the game, but unfortunately because Miiverse is no more, we can't show the world our stamp of Midna. One really weird and not good change though is Epona. In the GameCube and Wii version, you could pretty much control them in any way you want, it's pretty flexible. But for some reason in the HD version, the control stick doesn't respond until you hit like a 90-degree angle, so minor movements just aren't really possible on the horse. It's either full left or full right, and that's it. I don't know why they did this, but it's not good. So Twilight Princess HD isn't like a drastic change for the game, but it does modernize it in some really nice ways, and it's probably one of the best visual remasters of this entire set. It's up there with Majora's Mask 3D for sure. But anyway, the final and newest game, Skyward Sword HD. So Skyward Sword's a really strange one, because this came out when they started remastering Zelda games. It was the very same year as Ocarina of Time 3D, so inherently the game itself already had some of the quality of life stuff that these remasters have. So what's kind of fascinating about this one is it goes a bit beyond the other remasters in some ways, and in other ways doesn't really change that much. So it's going from 480p widescreen of the Wii version to 1080p widescreen on Switch, but this time it's 60 FPS. And that makes a giant difference. Skyward Sword HD doesn't do that much to change everything about the game, but the changes it does make carry with you for the entire adventure. It's far more fluid and natural than the original, and it makes the Wii version very hard to go back to. I want all these remasters in 60 FPS. Ocarina, Majora, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, put them all on Switch at this frame rate. Now while this game was designed with motion controls in mind, you can play them without them on Switch. It works pretty well, and some people prefer it, but personally, I tend to play Wii Remote style with the Joy-Con. And one of the best parts of that is the right stick is free, meaning it can be a camera. Yeah, just like Majora's Mask 3D, they've added full camera support to Skyward Sword, and again, this is a game changer. 60 FPS and camera wherever you go? It changes how you move and how the game feels. It's far better than Wii. There is camera control when playing without motion, but you've got to hold down the L button because the right stick is the sword, so holding down the L button disables the sword and makes it a camera. It works okay, but it's not as natural as the right stick always being the camera. And again, and no hyperbole, one of the biggest things of these remasters is back in the Wii version, when getting an item, whether it be a rupee or a heart or just a material, it will tell you what it is every time you boot up the game, and it no longer does that. Thank the Lord. Alright, maybe this isn't as big as a deal as I'm making it out to be. Or maybe it is, baby! There is also autosave this time, which wasn't in the prior remasters. This came from Breath of the Wild, it was in Link's Awakening, and now it's in Skyward Sword HD. It's another thing I wish all the remasters had. Back in the Wii version of Skyward Sword, you could skip cutscenes in New Game Plus, but you couldn't skip them the first time. But now on Switch, you can skip them whenever you want, which again is something other remasters don't do. In Ocarina and Majora and Wind Waker, you can't skip cutscenes. They've also made text boxes much faster. I mean, look at this! You don't have to listen to anyone. Tutorials have been streamlined too, where Fia's much more quiet, and we did a comparison with the Wii version to leave Skyloft, and on Switch, we left in 14 minutes and 47 seconds, whereas on Wii, it took us 48 minutes and 21 seconds. Now granted, we skipped the cutscenes on Switch, which we couldn't on Wii, but still that's so much faster. And this is kind of funny because of the 10-year difference. So in Ocarina 3D, they gave you Sheikah stones to give you hints on where to go next, and Skyward Sword on Wii had that as well. But a decade later, and they've now removed the Sheikah stones in the Switch version. Just shows how perception and game design has changed in a decade. There's also the Loftwing amiibo that everyone loves, and scanning this takes you back to the sky no matter where you are. You can be in a house or in a dungeon, and you just tap, and away you go. It is basically fast travel on an amiibo, and that's pretty lame, but yeah, it's here. So Skyward Sword HD doesn't really change that much. Visually, the textures have been redone somewhat, but it's mostly just up-resing them rather than redoing them. But the changes it does make change the pacing of the entire game. The frame rate's been doubled, the text is faster, there's a camera. It just feels better to play Skyward Sword now, while maintaining its identity as Skyward Sword. So now we've gone through this exhaustive explanation of what they do and what they are, I guess it's time to rank them. Okay, so it's now time to actually rank these games. And if you've just skipped to this point in the video, and you've not listened to the other 20 minutes or 25 minutes or so, I do suggest going back, because I won't be explaining everything here. There's a lot of details for every single game for why I like and don't like these remasters, so definitely go back and watch those. But I guess we will start putting these in categories. Now, if you listen to them, I'm pretty sure you know what I think of Majora's Mask 3D. It's a good remaster in terms of the visuals and presentation, but in terms of what it does to the game, I am not fond of this remaster. So for me, this is the weakest one. Majora's Mask 3D right at the bottom. Now the other ones are much harder to rank. I feel like Skyward Sword HD does a lot to change the game. 60 FPS and a camera do change everything about how you move and operate in that game. But it's definitely not as drastic as the other remasters. So I think a solid C is a good point for that one. Now, this is where it gets very, very tricky, because I was rather critical of Wind Waker HD, but it also does change the game in many, many ways, far more drastically than Twilight Princess does, even though I think Twilight Princess does more change how the game actually looks. So, I think just because the Triforce quest was such a bother in the original game, and sailing is so much faster, Wind Waker probably deserves to be ahead of Twilight Princess, so Twilight Princess in B. Now, I've shown my hand for how the rest of this list is going to go, haven't I? Because I think Ocarina of Time is just such an incredible remaster. It's going from 20 FPS to 30 FPS, or 18 FPS to 30 if you live in the PAL regions. And it has so many amazing changes, like the Iron Boots now being an item is a drastic change for the Water Temple. And the visual makeover is remarkable too. So, putting these two side by side, I definitely think that Ocarina is the stronger of the two. So this was a rather quick ranking, but this is how I feel the games are in terms of quality. Not necessarily in terms of what they do to make the game look better, but just in terms of how they respect the originals and improve them. These aren't necessarily how I'd rank the games themselves, but just in terms of the remastering. Yeah, I think Ocarina of Time is the best one, followed by Wind Waker, followed by Twilight Princess, followed by Skyward Sword, and lastly Majora's Mask 3D. So, do any of you disagree with these points? And if you do, which you probably do, I want you to debate me in the comments below. And of course, go to that subscribe button and be sure to give it a lovely remaster with gyro controls. Boy oh boy do I love gyro subscribe buttons. And we'll see you next time. Bye everyone.